I'm going to go ahead and share my screen because I do have a PowerPoint presentation, and I do apologize. It says host disabled participant screen sharing. I do apologize because I am not the greatest at virtual presentations, and you would think like a year into the pandemic, I'd have gotten a grip and readjusted my life, but I just haven't. So I apologize. I'm not going to just sugarcoat that for anyone. So let's see here.
If you haven't had to become a Zoom master, then you're lucky. I feel like that's what I do now. So if you still have those opportunities to not be on Zoom constantly, that's a good thing. Yeah. So we appreciate you being on here.
Yes, actually, I should be a Zoom master. I am probably giving, several of these a month, but it just is still not my forte. What can I say? So thank you for having me. I am going to talk today about diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I know when Krista and I initially emailed, we highlighted racism and sexism. And in that time, I have done a few more presentations for people who have requested those topics. And one of the things that I have found is sometimes we have to do a little bit of a rewind, and I need to make sure that everyone has the same baseline when we talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion. So we're going to back it up even just a little bit, and before we hit the racism and the sexism. So I'm from the YWCA of the Sauk Valley, and if you're not familiar with us at the YWCA, we're dedicated to eliminating racism, empowering women, and promoting peace, justice, freedom, and dignity for all. Sometimes people don't realize that's what our mission is, but everything that we do within our YWCA, YWCA's nationwide, YWCA's worldwide, we are all directed at this mission. We're very proud of it. Locally, we have our own vision, and that's that we transform lives by creating a vibrant and diverse environment in which more women become independent, visible in leadership, and able to reach their full potential. And that our mission and work are embraced by a community united against violence and oppression. So we have a ways to go to make that happen, but that is our goal. We took it a step further at our YWCA about probably 12 years ago now, because we realized that we say a lot of things in our mission and vision, but what does that really mean? Are we truly embracing the things that we say? So even here at the YWCA, we're very introspective and self-reflective. We're constantly looking at how we can learn and grow in our understanding of being anti-racist and anti-sexist. We developed our own YWCA commitment to racial justice. And I highlight this because I think it shows that even as an organization that has this at the core of its operation, we still find that it's critical to make sure that we have baked it into our operations. We bake it into our systems. So we're thinking about it all the time and keeping it at the forefront of what we do. And I say this because I want for you as we go through today to be self-reflective and think about things that you can do to bake it into your core or what your school system could be doing to help that happen. So if you look at this, I'm not going to read it to you because it is lengthy, but we think about racial justice in terms of things like our policies and procedures, recruitment, retention, succession planning, professional development, program development, vendor relations. Who are we going to do business with? Why aren't we going to do business with them? So we try to keep these things at the forefront of our thought. And when we say at the bottom that we welcome suggestions to assist us in making these things happen, we actually mean it. And every year we ask our YWCA employees, we call them our team members here, we ask our team to give us feedback, to give us ideas, and then we
thank you.
Really cultivate and evolve.
I don't, maybe I should do that.
So at YWCA Valley, we cover all of Lee and Whiteside counties. We touch over 15,000 lives every year. Most people know we have comprehensive domestic violence services, everything from shelter to legal advocacy to counseling. Sexual assault services, we always have staff on call. We go to hospital call outs. We provide counseling services, legal advocacy. You're probably familiar with prevention education, where we have educators come into the classrooms, preschool all the way through students out at Sauk. We have an immigrant outreach program. I think maybe they came and talked to you last year about our immigrant services. We also do a lot of empowerment programming, girls groups, girls summit, different things like that, tech girls. And I like to highlight for everyone that we are inclusive, because so often people think YWCA and they think that we're just for women. And I like to encourage everyone to think about the fact that you've probably been to a YM, or your kids have played sports at a YM, and it doesn't matter what their gender identity is, does it? But for some reason, when it comes to the YWCA, people get stuck at that W, and the W is only for women, but that's not true. So please remember that we are truly for everyone. So that's our YW in a really quick nutshell. And I'm going to pause to see if anyone has questions before I move on. Yes.
Well, I'm wondering, since you brought that up, why do they even put the M and the W in those? I feel like they should get rid of the sexual identity or the gender identity to both of those, because I do feel like that's a confusing thing now that you brought that up.
And so we're actually two totally different organizations. We were not founded together. We're not connected in any way. And so a lot of people don't realize that either. And there is movement among YWCAs who have changed from Young Women's Christian Association, legally having their name be just YWCA and their location, and not having those letters stand for anything, because there's also the thought that Christian can also be very isolating and not inclusive to everybody anymore. And so we have pondered that here at YWCA Sauk Valley. Our challenge is that it costs money. I hate for that to be the factor, but you know, we've really talked about it a lot in the last couple of years, and we're considering it before we went into last year. And at this point with the pandemic and, you know, everyone's having a money crunch, we have put that on hold. But yeah, I completely agree. And so does YWCA. YWCA USA is no longer Young Women's Christian Association of the USA. They're just YWCA USA. Mm-hmm. Other questions? Great question. Thanks for asking that. Pointing that out. I appreciate that. Nope. Okay. So my ask for today, if I see I have a typo, I apologize for that. I'm sure teachers hate typos. Don't be afraid of self-reflection. I've got to tell you, I have been doing diversity, equity, inclusion trainings for 16 years now, and I continue to learn and grow and participate in all kinds of other trainings myself, because I realize that it's all about the process of evolution. We learn and think in new ways every day, and we stand on the shoulders of the people who came before us, and knowledge evolves. So I encourage you to do the same. It's not a bad thing. And the last one is probably the toughest: to always try to learn what you don't know and to see what you can't see. And every time I say that to people, they ask how that's even possible. And it's a very difficult thing to do. But one of the ways that we have institutionalized racism and sexism is that if the people with all of the power don't know it and can't see it, it just continues to persist. And so if you are a person with any kind of power or authority, you really are called upon to that higher level to try to learn what is it that you don't know and what is it that you're not seeing, because there's a lot of it. I'm going to give you what I consider to be my selfie. So all of my perspectives, all of my thoughts, everything that I will share to you is influenced by my life experiences and who I am. It's influenced by the fact that I am white, that I am female and heterosexual, that I am cisgender using the pronouns she, her, and hers. I'm able-bodied. I'm emotionally well, usually. I'm a US citizen. I speak English. I'm a Christian Catholic raised, and that I was raised and live in rural USA. And I do this because I know that these influence the lens that I see the world and the way that I talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion. And it's really important to acknowledge that. And that's not a bad thing. I can acknowledge that I have bias. I can acknowledge that there are times I catch myself holding on to stereotypes. I can acknowledge that I have privilege. But by identifying that and trying to work to see the other side of the coin, that's when I can make things happen. And having privilege, being white, it's not a bad thing. Being heterosexual, it's not a bad thing. Speaking English, not a bad thing, you know, and so we should not be ashamed of who we are. We should own it. This is my truth and this is who I am. So I'd like to start out with, let's define diversity. What is it? Oops, I went back. I have a clicker finger sometimes, I'm sorry. So what's diversity? Anybody? No. So it's the variety, right? Being different, having all sorts of different representations. So it could be gender, sexual orientations, races, skin colors. I like to use this graphic because I think that's a helpful way to illustrate what diversity is. It's all kinds of people being all kinds of together. Very simplistic. You could be in a wheelchair, you could not be in a wheelchair. You can have tattoos, you could not have tattoos. So all kinds of people. So then we get to the E in DEI, equity. Does anyone want to try to define equity? Nope, that's okay. So it's really, according to Webster, freedom from bias or favoritism, something that's equitable. And again, I like to use a graphic because I think that helps. I think a lot of times people get equality and equity confused. And with equality, it's the idea that everyone has the chance to go to the game. But with equity, we can make sure that everybody actually gets to see the game. And so there's a very big difference. So these are things people don't have any control over, right? Your height, you're in a wheelchair, but they affect your ability to see the game. But here, we get everyone to see it. Did you have a question?
Not a question as much as a comment. We were talking in our anti-racism group the other night where we've used this image for a lot of things over past years and whatnot. And we came to this, I don't know, it was a conversation that where we were recognizing how much our community needs to be learning about a lot of this as well alongside. And we were talking about the equality, the equity, and the conversation got to going. And then basically we got to the point where we're like, but really ultimately what we need to try to figure out how to do is remove the fence. Like it was a really great conversation. Like
you're foreshadowing.
Oh, am I? Oh, I'm sorry.
I'm
sorry. Okay.
That's excellent. Yay. Thank you.
Okay.
No, that's perfect because that's what's coming.
Okay.
So,
I'll listen along. Here we go.
Because most people don't get to that point. And so for me, that's very exciting to think that we have people out there in the Sauk Valley talking about it. So that like really just tickles my heart. So thank you. Seriously, thank you. But you're right, there's this fence there and it's holding people back. So if we go to DEI, we get to the I part and it's inclusion. So what is inclusion? I'll just fill it in. So it's feeling like you're included, having that access to the opportunities and the resources, not being marginalized. And again, I love a graphic. And so with diversity, you have all the pieces of the puzzle, but with inclusion, you actually can fit them together and it creates something. Diversity, this is just a little awkward. It's just stuffed together. And a lot of times we think that's the goal, just having diverse people represented. And it's not necessarily about just representation. At what point do we get to the inclusion? And then let's take it one step further. What about belonging? I know in school systems, you talk about belonging a lot. And it's really important when we start talking about all kinds of topics surrounding oppression. You know, diversity is being invited to the party. Inclusion is being asked to dance. We've heard that a lot. But belonging is when you can dance like no one's watching. And I think that that's huge because so often we get stuck over here and people know that they've just been invited for the sake of diversity. Sometimes we ask people questions or we want them to partake a little bit, but we don't truly make them feel accepted or comfortable. But then when you get to belonging and you can dance like no one's watching, what starts to happen? What would happen for your students if they could all dance like no one was watching? How would that feel and what would school be like? And what would their futures be like?
Go ahead, Stace.
I was just going to say it would be very authentic. You know, if kids truly got to be who they were without any fear of judgment or all the awful things that kids do to each other.
Isn't that the truth? And not just kids, but adults. These adults do it too. And there's so many things that can influence someone's feeling of belonging. There's so much that goes into that, and that's all of their life experiences, right? It's all of these things here outside the circle of belonging, someone's housing situation, their citizenship status, their refugee status, their skin color, their life experience, so many things. And yes, their gender, their sexuality, they influence how someone feels like they can belong. And if you don't belong, you don't participate the same way. And what's hard is that there is this waterline of visibility, right? We see all these things up here at the top, and we have no idea of all these things that are under the water. And all of these things that are under the water are what holds up what's at the top. And as adults in the lives of children, you can't necessarily see everything, but when you know that those things are there, and you can see that you probably have students who fall in somewhere on this spectrum of having some of these challenges or having some of these privileges, you can start to see how it influences their feelings about belonging. Oops. So here we go. We get to the part where we're going to break down the fence, because really, like Deanna talked about, that's what we need to have happen. You know, we can have equality where you can get everybody up to the fence. You can have equity where you can get everyone to see the game. But with justice, you can begin to break the fence down. And with liberation, and I guess this is a parade, we're not at a game anymore. You can actually have people celebrating and truly participating and enjoying in a different way. There isn't anything holding them back. There can be lots of pitfalls on the way to making this happen. And so I would encourage you to think about some of those things. We have this tendency to blame marginalized or oppressed groups. I think we see it a lot. A very easy example to point out would be people who have lower incomes. We tend to think that people who have lower incomes or struggle financially, it's their own fault, it's their own decisions. And we have no idea all of the other life situations that have gone into creating them having a lower income, because it can be so many things. And additionally, we always have this idea when we talk about money that if you're financially worth less money, you're worthless, right? That's one thing that's very easy, but we do it with all sorts of types of oppression. We do it with race, we do it with gender, we do it with ability status. There's also implicit bias, and I don't know how much implicit bias training you have, and I have a website that I will share before we're done. If you haven't taken the Harvard implicit bias test, I would encourage you to do it. It's actually really good, and it helps you really analyze yourself and think about what your biases are. Because before you can really help someone else, you have to understand yourself and know where your own pitfalls are. A lot of times we fall into this white savior complex where you're going to be the great white knight and save the world. And well-meaning people do this. We do it in a very unconscious way. I look back and I can think of times when I have done that myself. And you have to be very careful. People don't want to be saved. That's not what people want. People want empowerment. They want opportunity. And that's what's really necessary to create racial justice, to create sexual equity. That's what we need to have happen. White Fragility, if you have not read that book, I would encourage you to read it. It really takes you to understanding that place of discomfort that we all start to experience when we talk about racism and about being white. Robin DiAngelo wrote it. And last year at the YWCA, we decided that we would have all of our team members read that book because we felt like it could help propel some people who are maybe struggling with the racism piece to a new level. And as we were passing the book out, I had quite a few staff say to me, "Why are you making me read this? Why am I doing this?" I don't need this. I'm not racist. So many things. And then they read the book and they came back and they said, okay, I get it now. I'm so glad that we did that. That really has changed my thoughts and my way of looking at things. And so it's an entire book, so I can't give you a presentation on it in just a few minutes, but I would encourage you to look for that and to be able to name your own white fragility. I don't know if any of you have read it and found it beneficial or helpful, but it's a pretty easy read. If you have a book group, it would be great. There's a book guide out there for it as well.
In fact, Stacy and I are going to do, well, we're looking into doing another book study. We try to do some every semester or summer. And so that was one of them as we were looking at some different equity. That one came up several times that I thought looked really good. So we will put that on our book list for our summer group. And I also had a question in the chat for the Harvard. No, it came to me, so not to you. Harvard, the Harvard implicit bias test, is that free or does it cost?
It's free.
Okay.
Yep, it is free. It's open to anybody. They encourage people to do it, which is really great. Were there other questions as we're pausing?
That's all so far.
Okay, sounds good. Let's see.
Oh, Dina did suggest, she said, I'm Still Here by Austin Channing Brown is also a great read.
Yes.
So.
Yes, I do agree. That is a good one too. And anything by Ibram Kendi. And he actually has one. He has one for babies. He has ones for students. He has one for adults. So he has it across all age levels. He also has a Facebook page and he does lots of Facebook Lives and things. But his book for adults is How to Be Anti-Racist. I had to look up at my bookshelf to see it. I apologize. And that one is also really good. And he really hits on the difference between not being racist and being anti-racist. So I think when you talk about anything surrounding diversity, equity, and inclusion, you really have to be able to define oppression. And so oppression, you know, if you look at the root of the word press, it's something that's really holding someone down. It's something that someone doesn't have any control over, but it really does weigh them down. It can be very obvious, it can be disguised, it can be unknown, but it is there. And there's all kinds of oppression that people can experience. And so you may have seen this before. They call it the cage of oppression. And this is actually quite an old graphic. But you see here some of the different types of demographics that can affect people's life experiences, their gender, race, socioeconomic class, ability. They said sexual orientation. We would probably say sexual identity now, religion. And you see for gender, you have women who are being held at the bottom of the cage and men who would rise to the top. Race, people of color, and then people who are white would go to the top. And so they break it down like that. I also have another nice handy chart that, again, helps us identify oppression and privilege, because we need to remember that for the opposite of oppression, there is someone that has privilege. And again, these aren't things that people have control over. So like I talked about in my selfie, I identify as white, and there's nothing wrong with that. I'm not ashamed of who I am. But I also know that there are times in my life that gives me privilege. And so then you would look at who wouldn't have the privilege, who would be in the oppressed group. Well, people who identify or who are Asian, Black, Latino, Native Americans. And then it names it with the ism. So this can be really handy. So you have racism. When we talk about sex, you'd have sexism. Gender, you'd have transgender oppression. Sometimes we also say homophobia, sexual orientation, heterosexism, classism, ability or disability, ableism, Move my people so I can see the chart. Religion, you'd have religious oppression. Age, you'd have ageism. So lots of different ways that people can be oppressed. And chances are, just like I showed in my selfie, people fall, oops, my clicker finger, people fall in different sides of the oppression and privilege. And so that's really important to acknowledge, that it's very rare to find someone who would fall in all of the oppressed categories or all of the privileged categories. There's usually some sort of a mix. Do we have any questions at this point? Okay. And so that brings us to intersectionality. And I think we've heard a lot about that in the last year. And it's the idea that there's all kinds of oppressions, just like we talked about, and you could fall into different spectrums. And so, you know, you can be white, but you could be female and you could be low income. You could be white, you could be from another country, you could be white and disabled. So, I mean, there's just all sorts of different ways, and intersectionality is the ways that oppression overlaps. So this graphic is very handy because you can see that there's all sorts of ways that it could occur. And obviously this does not include every type of oppression that there could be. This is the website for that bias test. And I would encourage you to take it if you have not. And I will send that to you, Krista, and you could share it with the group. How is that? It's also very Googleable, and someone could Google it if they felt more urgent. So when we talk about bias, it's really important to talk about it because it influences everything we do. It influences the way we interact with each other. It influences the way that we interact with our coworkers, with our students, with parents. And there's all kinds of ways that bias can occur. And a lot of times we don't even realize it. We start doing things like having groupthink. When you're surrounded by people who are just like you all the time, you start to get that groupthink happening. And you have this idea that, well, everybody must think like us because we all are thinking this. The same thing with false consensus. A lot of times, people who do not fall into one of those privileged categories have a very hard time speaking up, or we tend to gloss over whatever it is, don't fully hear them, that whatever it is they're saying, and we get these ideas of false consensus. And so it's really important for us to think about bias and how we're going to tackle it. So again, that goes back to that self-reflection piece and being honest with yourself and thinking about what would you need to do to really tackle your biases. How do you see them coming out? Do you ever see them coming out? And if you do, what do you do? And that's hard. That is really hard. And I've got to tell you, I do that all the time, especially if I am confronted with a problem or if I am confronted with a situation where I have to make a decision and everybody agrees with me. As soon as everybody agrees with me, I know that there's something wrong. And as soon as I think I know the answer instantly, I think to myself, how do I know that instantly? Let's analyze this. Sometimes it's things that are very simple. I can remember one time I was driving home from work and I was driving by an apartment complex and I saw a group of boys who were not dressed very nice out running. And I was like, uh-oh, what are those boys up to? And then I thought to myself, hey, Rebecca, you have a house full of boys at home that often go out running with friends and doing things, probably don't even know what all they do when I'm not watching, and they're not always dressed the nicest. Would I want someone making a thought like that about my kids? Probably not. You know, and it's those snap things that we think about and being really willing to confront yourself because we do it. Whether or not we realize it. We do it at the grocery store, we do it at work, everywhere we go, and there's a reason we do it, right? You need to have some bias in your life because it's a survival tactic. You need to be able to differentiate between threats and non-threats. but you also have to be able to rein that in and know the difference between when you're actually identifying threats and when you're just being biased. There is a difference. And so what can you do to be an ally? And this gets a little bit harder, and I think it's probably very difficult in a school setting. I know that in a school setting, you have all sorts of regulations, especially during a pandemic, you have all kinds of things that you're trying to tackle. But it's really important to accept the role of being an ally. And really, that's a strategy that as an educator or a counselor that you need to take on. You need to be willing to do things like speak out against injustice, to be able to actually sniff out implicit bias. That's a hard one to do. Use your eyes to identify privilege. Sometimes that's really hard to do, but who are the students who have the most privilege? How does that come out in school? What does that look like? What does that mean for the other students? And if you're a student and you have been in school for 8 years and you don't have very much privilege, and you're continually confronted with all of those other students and marginalized, what is your experience like? And then how do the adults in the school see that playing out and coming out? What happens? You have to use your ears to listen to other people's experiences, right? We all only have one set of eyes that we see the world through. So I don't know what someone else's experiences are or how it's affected them. I know that racial trauma is real. I know that I have friends who aren't white, and all of the things that happened in the last year and all the things that they continually had to hear about in the media, that was continually traumatizing for them and exhausting. And they could break down in tears because it was just too much by the time they got through it. I can remember the first time I had a conversation with a woman who was Black and she had grown up in the South. And she talked to me about what it was like growing up in the South during the 50s and 60s and what it was like to hear about lynchings and what that did to her and how upsetting it still was for her and the nightmares it gave her. I've never had that experience, but that's very real. That's something that she carries with her and affects the way that she sees the world. I have to trust that because I haven't had that experience. I've had the privilege of not having that experience. In Whiteside County, we have one of the highest rates of child abuse and sexual abuse in the state. I don't know if you know that, but we really do. Most victims of sexual abuse are girls. When we survey girls, we know that they are continually the victims of sexual harassment. Some it may not affect, but there's a lot out there that it affects. It begins to affect the way that they interact with each other. We need to listen to their experiences, things that feel icky, things that bother them or upset them or trigger them. There are probably reasons. And figuring out ways to support them and do what's best for them, those are very individual. But being there and being open to hearing those experiences is critical. You have to have a heart to cultivate empathy for people who are oppressed. You can't be angry. You can't blame them, especially if they're worn out. And maybe you'll see that more with parents where they're exhausted, or maybe there are times where you think, I really don't think that was racism, something that they're complaining about, but they're saying it was. Being able to actually listen and have empathy for what they're saying and for what their lived experience has been is critical. And then having hands to take action and make change. And that's probably the hardest thing because you can do things internally and you could be there for someone, but actually taking a stand and making change, speaking up, those are really hard things. And those are times where maybe someone stands alone because maybe you work really hard to try to identify privilege or to sniff the bias out and other people around you aren't. Maybe you've paid attention and you've seen things that other people have been oblivious to, or people don't want to hear, or they're defensive to. But if someone doesn't speak up or support those students, then who does? And that's a really hard place to be. But these things, I think, are really critical. When they say anatomy of an ally, that's really what students in school need. They need someone who can be there unconditionally and who can support them and listen to them. And it's okay to not know all the answers. I've told you I continually learn and read, even though I have been doing presentations for, over 16 years. I continue to learn and grow. And it's okay. That's what we all need to do. And that's what people want. They want that willingness of other people to listen and to learn and to grow. Can you think of ways that you can be an ally to students in your schools? Or some good examples of things that you've seen other people do that you could share?
I would say, just as you said you learned from your friend about her lynching experience, or living through that. We need to teach our children that there are other perspectives, and the best way to do that is to hear them. So I think just providing that time for them to hear each other's stories and their life experiences, and try to understand perspective from another side is how we're going to grow our children to have the empathy and support for others, become that ally.
Mm-hmm.
Marcia?
I have a weird question. and maybe it's not relevant in this, but it kind of is. It makes me think of when we do a unit on like school, is it a right or a privilege? And we talk about Malala, and how in some countries women don't get the right to go to school. It's an interesting thing when you look across the classroom and you bring up these topics, all of a sudden you can see the boys going, boys are better than girls. You can see that registering. Same thing happens when we do our civil rights unit, because in Dixon, there isn't a lot of African-American kids. There'll be a couple in your room. And then all of a sudden you can see the kids going, I didn't know that before. It's almost like you gave them a new idea, and I hate that. I'm not sure how to do that better. Or do you see where I'm coming from?
I do. I was actually just going to say, you have to be very careful not to traumatize then your students of color and, your girls, because those are things that happen. And it's also hard because in a lot of ways, we're counting on parents and other people in our culture to help us do that heavy lift and provide the education, and they're not.
Right.
And so I can remember, obviously I work at the YWCA and I'm a feminist, and I'm very proud to say that. So I can remember having four boys, and like the first time having to talk about equality and the thought that women didn't used to be able to vote, and how awful I felt and how awkward, because it is almost like saying, oh my gosh, like I used to not have the right, I was saying I didn't have the right that you would have had. And does that mean that I'm worthless? Does that mean that that was right? And so that is really hard. So you have to stay in tune to your students. And I don't have the best answers to that. It used to be called Teaching Tolerance, and I was going to give this resource a little later on, but now they've changed it to Learning for Justice. And they have some really great resources out there about not re-traumatizing students. And so I would encourage you to check those things out, because I completely understand what you're saying.
And it's a historical thing. So, and we do a civil rights unit. It's historical. We read a couple of stories where, that comes up. And sometimes I always think, should I just skip over that part of history? But it's, what I'm saying? It's a weird experience when you look across the room and you can see, not all of them, but some of them, the girls becoming upset because they're like, wait a minute, what? Because they don't know life any different. And the boys going, it doesn't happen with all the kids, but you can see a few, and it needs to be discussed. It needs to be seen, but It's kind of like,
Yeah.
oh, did I just teach, would it be better if you just never brought it up at all?
Did I just plant the seeds of racism and sexism in someone's head that wasn't already there?
Yeah,
But,
a little bit.
I would also say, I don't think you did plant the seeds, because if those seeds were there, they were planted by someone else. And I'm sure that as a teacher, when you're presenting that information, you're not presenting it in a way of, white people are fabulous and men are superior. And, so that's really hard. And it's also really hard because my natural instinct would be to emphasize then the horrible parts of that. But how traumatizing then is that for, like, you're the only student of color in the room to have to hear about slavery and endure that, because that is also very traumatizing. And I don't have a good answer. I really don't. But I completely empathize. I understand where you're coming from. And yeah.
Marcia, I will tell you that ISB is taking this. This is kind of why a lot of this equity talk this conversation is happening, which is amazing. But ISB is in the process of rewriting a lot of their social science standards. They want to start including perspectives from all perspectives, not just kind of the white male history that we know in our textbooks. And they are also coming out with some of these culturally relevant standards that they're giving to the pre-service teachers so that they can start understanding some of these bias and implicitness that they might see as they, when they get into the classroom, so they can kind of start learning about it beforehand. So I think it's coming, but you're right, it is really hard right now. So, but just the fact that you recognize it, I think goes a long way.
Yeah, and the fact that, like, if you look through what we read, it's mostly from a white perspective. And then all of a sudden, when you do read something about African Americans, it's about when they didn't have privilege instead of, hey, they're just, you know what I'm saying? I think all of it does need to be written but it's probably going to be a while before that gets published and school districts can buy it and it gets on that plane.
Marcia, I was going to say real quick something I used to teach middle school English language arts, and when the N-word would be in a novel, and it was, I mean, like good books, and it was very per the time of the story, and so we would talk about how we don't use this in our language, and talk about all those things. But the same, by me saying it and saying, if I was reading aloud, I don't use this word in my everyday vocabulary. And same, I taught in a very small school, and maybe there was one, African-American student, and am I making the situation worse? Or, yeah, I struggled with that all the time. And what you said really related to me, because I had those exact same feelings. And every year reading that book and not knowing how to handle that.
And I would say, and we talk about this a lot at the YW, it's Black History Month, and Black history should be American history. We talk about that during Hispanic Heritage Month, Women's History Month, that those should be just regular parts of our learning every day. And so how can you incorporate that and lift that up all year long? So it isn't just that one time, and you do have those other positive points of reference. And it is really important to acknowledge and understand that if we're always talking about just the negative and just the oppression and just the discrimination, that's the impression that students are left with. That's what they walk away with. And so when do we lift up those other pieces and those other examples? And it's so ingrained. I, do a lot, like everybody does, of self-development. And, I'm always reading books about leadership, and continually the examples that they give will be of white men. And it's like nails on a chalkboard for me. And I recently read one where, swear to God, the only time the guy talked about a woman was when he was talking about how his wife wasn't a leader, but she was a great interior decorator. And, it's just there all the time. And, if I'm exhausted, what does that mean for other students? And so finding ways, I think, to be very mindful of incorporating diversity, equity, and inclusion, because that is how you cultivate your sense of belonging. And you have to do that all year long. It takes a lot of effort.
And just to add in, kind of the same reason why the YWCA doesn't change their name is because of money. It's the same thing when it comes curriculum.
Oh, yeah.
It's a money issue, not that we don't know what's right and wrong, but it's not just time, but finding those resources or paying for those resources. It's that money part of it too.
Totally.
Yeah.
We're finding out as we're starting to do things. I guess I don't even know if the word differently is the right word. I don't know what the word is, but as I'm finding out that I wasn't prepared for now, as we're trying to do some things better and have the conversations like what Marcia and Stacy were talking about. And trust me, we're messing it up all over. Like we're trying, we just like, and then we keep on tripping, but we're trying to be honest with the kids about like, this is a conversation that I don't like. Let's talk about how to have it. Like we're a 3-5 building. So it is. And so then then you think you did something good and had a conversation in the classroom. And I always think I did something good until I find out I didn't, because then parents are calling and they're losing their minds because we talked about like we live in a very rural community, and I love where we live. I live in the district, but at the same time, I've had more conversations in the last 20 days about we have some LGBTQ posters in the hallway, and I'm so proud of our kids because 2 years ago they read Wonder, and they made posters that say be kind, be nice, and whatever, and that's lovely. I love that. That's my world, I guess sometimes I live in. But then now this year they read Wonder and they came away from it with, don't use the word gay as a bad word. Don't use like everybody, because some of the kids on the playground, when somebody gets mad at somebody, they're like, God, don't be so gay or whatever. So one of the kids made an amazing poster, and they did like I want to say, like, remember the Ghostbusters thing with the slash through it, and they put the word gay in it with the slash through it to say don't use the word gay as a bad word. Oh, I thought, like, people just are losing their minds. This is a 10-year-old kid's version of a way to say don't be mean on the playground. And we got to let them discuss it. And again, we have parents calling, losing their mind because I let them put up a poster that said that. And it's up still, and we're going to keep it up because what it's for is great. But then I'm sitting here trying to convince a parent that it's, I don't know how to convince parents that this is like a public school and that we are going to discuss things like this. And I don't know I don't know. That's the part that I think when I saw this, I was like, I struggle with that because it's like you guys are talking too. It's a learning thing for us too, if we're honest about how we're trying to get there. Thanks, Ashley. But I wasn't expecting to have conversations with. So yeah, that's kind of where we're at too. Marcia, like, yeah, your face is like, yep, okay, yep. And I want to do better. I just don't know what. And I don't want to I can't tell a parent, you're being pretty small minded, because that's what I want to say. Like,
and so just for my clarification, was the parent upset because they thought it was anti-gay, or because they thought that we shouldn't talk about sexual?
Well, I had both. So I had one parent that thought I was anti-gay, and when I explained that it was not trying to eliminate homosexual people, it was not a sign to eliminate that. It was literally telling kids, don't use that as a slang term because it might hurt somebody's feelings. It's not a good idea. And that parent was totally cool.
Okay.
The other parent, they'd probably lose their mind because I have a rainbow LGBTQ sign on my door right now that like the girls made for me, because they felt that we needed to make sure everybody that came in our building knew that we accept everybody. And so, because I asked them, I said, tell me the reason you made it and tell me where you want to put it. And they could tell me that. But yeah, I had a parent just about lose his mind because I allowed kids to put up posters like that and he pays taxes here. And I'm like, yeah, you do, because it's a government building, which we will teach that and we will be okay. And like, but I don't know, like, what do you say to parents and they're losing their minds that like.
So that's really hard because people do lose their minds over these issues. At our building, we have signage on our bathrooms that talk about being gender inclusive and some various things like that. We had a visitor who came here from Texas. I don't even know why she was in our building, saw the signs, went back home and wrote me a 4-page letter about how horrible that was. And she was still losing her mind in Texas. She doesn't even live
Okay.
here,
All
you know,
right.
and I think that, you know, and I do get emails like that from people. And, you know, depending on what we have on our window or hanging on the side of our building, we will have people stop and, you know, shout at us or talk to us about it because they're upset or they disagree. And I think some of it is our climate right now, you know, just how polarized and inflamed everything is for everybody everywhere.
Okay.
And so I do think that that's a little bit of it. But I always approach it with, you know, not being defensive. This is, you know, when I think about it from the YWCA perspective, this is who we are, this is what we do, and this is the way it's going to be. Because you can't win those battles.
Okay. All right.
Yeah.
Just like this is what we do. Okay. This is who
Yeah.
we are. I like that.
Mm-hmm.
I
You
like
know,
that.
you're
Okay.
not going to change someone with a few sentences or an email or a short phone conversation, because that's a life of learning. And
Okay.
so it's also, though, important to acknowledge then that their child is probably coming into school with some of those thoughts or, you know, mixed feelings or being unsure.
Because they probably want to please both mom and dad and us and make sure everybody's, because they're little. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. That's a good point. I appreciate that.
So were there other thoughts or comments as we pause here? No.
I would just say such great conversations. I'm enjoying hearing everyone's perspective. So thank you.
Mhm. Yeah, the conversation is great. Thank you very much. So I have some things as we get ready to wind down because I see we're at 3:53, and so I'm gonna speed up a little bit here and encourage you just to even look at things, you know, with a critical eye in the ways that sometimes we don't even realize that we are maybe making someone else secondary. So here we look at, you know, woman, you know, women are always secondary, you know, it's always the male that is the root, that is the foundation. And what kind of a message does that send? And so that's an example. And there's lots of examples of ways that we do that with language all throughout our culture. You know, it's in messages, you know, I follow on Facebook Man Who Has It All because it's really quite comical for me. And sometimes I need comedic relief, you know, but they'll post things. What assumptions can we make about a man's commitment to his career when he becomes a father? Probably nothing, you know, but women receive these messages all the time. You know, this is another funny one I enjoy, the messages that we give to people. Are you the comedian? Usually this would be female comedian, but this one says male comedian. But do you also hear Black comedian, Asian comedian? What's our default set at? We do it without even thinking. We have whiteness and maleness so centered at everything we do, it's just automatic and it seems normal. So seeing this, it's comical. But if you think about it, in the many ways that we see that play out, it isn't quite as comical because those are messages, especially children take in, internalize, and think about. What is centered? What's at the center of our culture? This is an oldie, but still a goodie. Wife of Bears lineman wins a bronze medal. She just gets to be the wife. That's it. I'm guessing the Bears lineman in 2016 probably wasn't even that great. And we're Bears fans. You know, 81% of students report sexual harassment. 87% say it has a negative effect on them. I've got to tell you, I was shocked this was as low as it was. I would have thought it would be virtually every student in the school. So I found that, I don't know if that would say refreshing, but a little bit surprising that it would be that low. So it's out there. It is happening. You know, look like a girl. I got to tell you, I get so sick of women being referred to as girls because it means that they're little, that they can't take care of themselves, that they need someone to take care of them and make decisions and protect them. Act like a lady, but think like a man and work like a boss. I got to tell you, I'm the boss. and I encourage you to think about how it is that you can make diversity, equity, and inclusion part of what becomes automatic. How do you treat your students? Which parents get their emails returned first? What assumptions are you making? And thinking about that continually, who is it that you give feedback to? Who is it that you recognize the most? Those star students that are always at the top, who are they? How'd they get there? What does that look like? And what can you do to build up those other students? I will send Krista these links so she can share them, but Learning for Justice is a really great one. Lots of resources in there. Trying Together, anti-racism tools. It's for schools. It is another great one, just lots of ideas. I think that as we think about schools, this is a newly evolving area. There has always been some, diversity work happening, and then we moved to diversity, equity, and, inclusion. And now we're starting to talk about actual belonging, and it keeps evolving. And so there's lots of resources and tools out there because you are on the forefront, and I applaud you all for making the effort to try to make those things happen in your schools and in your classrooms. It takes a lot of commitment. It's really hard work. And there's lots of times where I would say that you would be standing alone. You could run into situations where you don't have a school administrator that's going to support the poster that hangs in the hallway, or ways to try to make your curriculums more inclusive. There are always going to be parents and complainers, and really haters are going to hate. I can't say that enough. There's just some people, they have a lifelong learning themselves, and it's very difficult to move them. And when we talk about people's children, we become even more defensive and more protective. So it takes a lot of commitment, and it takes being strong. I'm always happy to talk or offer up ideas or other resources. I don't consider myself to be an expert, but I know other people who can sometimes be of more help than I certainly could be. And I'm always willing to help connect people with others. So you can always think of me as a resource as well. And when Krista shares those websites with you, she could also share my email address. So what other questions or comments do you all have? Concerns?
I thought I would just say, when you came across that slide on the sexual harassment, that 81% could be low because people may not know that what has happened to them would be defined as sexual harassment. So you saying that the number is probably higher could be because of that reason.
That's a really good point. And I would tell you, as the provider of domestic violence services in the Sauk Valley area, oftentimes victims don't realize they're the victims of domestic violence. And oftentimes, you're right, girls and women don't identify sexual harassment as harassment because they are just so used to it.
Right.
They're so groomed for it.
I have a comment. So one of the things that I do to kind of sneak in being an ally or showing support to for diversity is I teach high school English and public speaking. And so on my board, like on the old chalk rail, I'll put books that I'm reading all at the same time. And then I'm crazy. Sometimes I get mad at myself. I get home at night and realize I left my books at school, but I carry them to and from. And so one that I have with me right now is one we're doing. I think it's pretty popular right now in the community, but at my church, we're reading The Savvy Ally. So I'll put that on the chalk rail. I have another book over there called Wintering. I lost my father to COVID in November. And so, I'm dealing with the loss of that. And so I have that book. And then I'm reading one about good eating and health. And I myself had COVID and put on weight. And so I just put all these books where they can see, I'll say, here are good reads, or here's what Mrs. Schaefer's reading now. And I think they're more dumbfounded, like, you're reading 3 books at once or 4 books or whatever it is. Yeah. But I do that. So then maybe they'll ask me questions about the book, or they'll just know, oh, if she's reading that, she might be okay. I've done a lot of, I put some things on my chalk rail like an article I read, not necessarily a book on for Black History Month and so forth, just so that it might stir up a conversation or get a student thinking a different way without me advertising. I did try the rainbow and 2 was rejected by that in my classroom. So I had a phone call about that, and you know, I'm kind of a wreck right now the last few months. And so I took down the rainbow. I just really did, but I keep my book up. So that was kind of my compromise. But that's something you could do too, or even at the bottom of emails. I haven't done it recently, but I will have my name and under the signature say what I'm currently reading, and then I'll list what I'm reading that way too. I don't know, just an idea.
Good idea. Mhm. Yeah, subtle messages. Good
Yep.
idea.
Wonderful. Well, any other questions for Rebecca or comments for the good of the group? This was amazing conversation, and I'm excited to go take the Harvard test. I think that'll really reveal a lot for me personally. So that'll be some good self-reflection. And as Rebecca said, if you have any questions for her, I will get her email out to you guys, but also if you can always email me and I will pass your questions along. So Rebecca, thank you so much for being with us today, for sparking some really important conversations. Even little by little, we'll just keep going for it. So very excited to have this equity conversation throughout this month. So unless there's anything else, we will close for today. All right, great to see everyone.
Have a
Take
good night.
care.